Good evening, everyone, all those who are with us here in person and people online. How many people do we have online?
66.
All right, great. Good to be with you all. I'm Chavat Samuelson. I'm a Regents Professor of History. I'm also Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Director of Jewish Studies here at ASU. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Bartov to deliver the keynote address in Genocide Awareness Week of 2024. Now, not everybody in the room knows about GAW, as we call it, but Genocide Awareness Week. So let me tell you a little bit about it and why it is so important and significant initiative. It started in 2012 when John Lifferton of Scottsdale Community College put it all together. And he ran it for 9 years or so. And then before his retirement, a planned retirement from Scottsdale Community College, he came to us, to Volker and to me, suggested that maybe ASU can take hold of this project. And that's exactly what happened. We said, yes, of course, we will glad to do so because we recognize the significance of this quite unique experience. So why is it significant? First, I would say the Genocide Awareness Week allows us to study all genocides, including the Holocaust, in a comparative manner. We treat it as a historical phenomenon, phenomena, we should say it in the plural. We understand that it requires interpretation and understanding, but we should not mystify those genocides. We need to go deeper and really get to the heart of the matter. Second, Genocide Awareness Week carries its analysis in an interdisciplinary manner by consulting many academic disciplines, including history and sociology and political science, religious studies, comparative literature, media studies, and the list can go on and on. So we are very committed to interdisciplinarity as much as ASU is committed to that ideal. Third, Genocide Awareness Week seeks to integrate cutting-edge scholarship with the memory and experiences of living communities who have been impacted by genocides. And there are people in this room, of course, who have been personally impacted by genocides. Fourth, this project is a statewide initiative that involves several institutions. So in addition, of course, to Scottsdale Community College, we are working very closely with our friends and colleagues in Northern Arizona University and the University of Arizona to the south of here. Northern Arizona, of course, is the north of here. And we believe that this kind of collaboration between educational institutions is very important for the state of Arizona. And it's easier said than done. So we are happy that our board of directors from the three institutions really work very well together. I'll thank them in a minute. Finally, Genocide Awareness Week is not just a scholarly project that shares cutting-edge scholarship, but it's really a public-facing educational initiative in which academic institutions collaborate with other civic institutions, whether it's the Finnic Holocaust Association, whether it's the Arizona Historical Society, Jewish Historical Society, whether it's the Armenian Center or Syrian community. We really believe in public-facing scholarship. So all of us are engaged precisely in this. And before I move to introduce Professor Bartov, I want to say thank you to a few important people. I'll start with Volker Benkert and Timothy Langille. These two people are on the board of directors, and they are really the co-chairs of Genocide Awareness Week. They put together the program. All the work that was necessary to put this together was done by them, and thank you very much for the work. We also should mention our people on the board of directors. Maybe where's Bjorn? Bjorn is here somewhere. Okay, Bjorn from Northern Arizona University, who also hosted Professor Bartov when was it? Last night? Yes, it was last night. Oh, from Sunday, actually, Sunday and Monday. And we have also Alex Alvarez. Is Alex here? No, but he's also from Northern Arizona University, who's here. And our colleague Gil Reebach, who is also on the board of directors. We are very thankful for all the work that they've been doing and really showing how three universities can work together. A third person I would like to thank is Richard Embry, Amesbury here, the director of Shippers. Shippers is the entity that puts together all the logistics, and Becky Tsang, his assistant, is also here, and we thank her and her staff for all the work that went into this kind of putting together a whole week of lectures and exhibits and films and book discussion. That's a lot of work. And finally, I would like to thank all the students who showed up, not just for this lecture, but to the lectures that we had this morning and for the next 2 days. So with all that, we can now turn to talk a little bit about our keynote speaker. So tragically, genocides have become rather common during the 20th century, often in the context of war. Nationalist ideologies, exclusionary policies, organized state violence, and technoscience have all come together to wreak havoc on entire populations, their social fabric, distinctive culture, and even the natural environment itself. Few scholars are more able to reflect on the confluence of these deadly forces than Professor Omer Bartov, who is Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He was born in Israel, educated in Tel Aviv University, also at St. Antony's College in Oxford, and his early research concerned war crimes in World War II, that the links between war and genocide and representations of anti-Semitism in 20th century cinema. I'll just give you 3 books from his early period. A book from 1992, Hitler's Army. The subtitle is Soldiers, Nazis, and War in the Third Reich. Second book is Murders in Our Midst, the Holocaust, Industrial Killing, and Representations. That's from 1996. And the third is Mirrors of Destruction, War, Genocide, and Modern Identity. So clearly he knows all there is to know about that chapter. But in most recent years, he shifted his focus a little bit, talking more about interethnic relations, on violence and population displacement in Europe and in Palestine. So here are 3 titles from the more recent work. One title is Anatomy of Genocide, The Life and Death of Town Called Buczacz. That's from 2018. Another title is Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking of the Galician Past. And the third is Genocide, the Holocaust and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. So obviously the focus for tonight's lecture is going to be more related to this last title that I just mentioned. And with that, I would like to make a point about decorum for this conversation this evening. The lecture will include reflections on the current events since October 7th, 2023. On that horrific day, 1,200 Israelis were brutally massacred and over 250 people abducted and taken hostages. The horrors were perpetrated by Hamas, a terrorist organization whose declared goal is the elimination of the state of Israel. In her self-defense, Israel declared war on Hamas with a goal of dismantling its military capabilities. However, because Hamas is embedded within the Gazan population, both above ground and below ground, using civilians as human shields in hospitals and in schools, the war in Gaza has caused massive human casualties and pervasive suffering of the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. As a result, Israel is now accused of perpetrating a genocide against the Palestinian people and has been losing global support. This situation is difficult, it's complex, and it is suffused with untold suffering. And yet, I believe at least, that on both sides of the Israel-Palestine divide, most people wish to coexist in peace and with dignity with each other. Our attempt to understand the complexity of the situation is conducive to this goal. In this room, I trust, and also online, people who are listening to this lecture hold very different views and conflicting opinions about the tragic situation in Gaza. On behalf of the Board of Directors of Genocide Awareness Week, I urge you to be respectful and civil toward each other and toward our speaker when you pose questions and when you make comments. We are here to learn, to understand, rather than to protest, to disrupt, or to make political statements. So With this in mind, let me invite Professor Bartov to the podium. His lecture is titled Uprooting and Displacement, Reflections on the Holocaust, Israel-Palestine, and the War in Gaza. Please. Come.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and comprehensive introduction. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for those people on Zoom and for organizing this conference. What I've heard of it has been very instructive and interesting, and I'm sure it will continue in this vein in the next couple of days. What I will try to do today is to analyze, to the best of my ability, both the current situation and its immediate and deeper roots. And because I want to be concise and I want to be as precise as I can, I will be reading a text, although I may occasionally wander in other directions. We are currently living through a period of unprecedented chaos and confusion in the Middle East. As some have predicted, there are signs that the turmoil is spreading ever wider, and of course, we just saw what was happening between Israel and Iran. Yet no formulas have yet been proposed as to how to put the genie back in the bottle. Violence, strife, and war have a logic of their own. And some of you may know the statement by the 19th century philosopher and theoretician of war, Clausewitz, about war, that he thought that war should be continuation of policy by other means, and that if war is not guided by policy, it becomes total war. It becomes absolute war, as he called it. And absolute war is just an exercise in destruction. So without conceptualizing concrete political goals, wars will keep expanding, feeding on the rage, sacrifice, and vengeance they produce, until at least one of the parties is either exhausted or wiped out. We having a problem? No? Okay. The disarray in which we find ourselves now in the Middle East, as I can understand it, is just one component of a general sense of bewilderment and uncertainty in the world. This confusion is rooted in various factors, ranging from economic anxiety, distrust of political leadership, massive displacement of populations, the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ongoing climate crisis. Now, in the face of such an array of threats and fears, one is tempted to simply withdraw into the private sphere, to shut out the news, and to engage as best one can with the pleasure, or at least the more manageable affairs of daily life. The problem with this choice is that it creates a vacuum, which tends to be swiftly filled by extreme voices. In other words, silence, unclarity, confusion, and passivity themselves generate polarization, whose outcome is ever more strife and violence. This is reflected, for instance, in the tendency of many to avoid political speech on university campuses for fear of being immediately labeled as supporting one camp or another. And obviously, I've also been exposed to that. If you support Israel, you support apartheid and ethnic cleansing. If you support the Palestinians, you must be anti-Semitic or a Holocaust denier. So in what follows, let me try to bring some order to the chain of events happening in Israel and Gaza. This can only be done by examining the immediate as well as the deeper roots of the current crisis. It also calls for dispelling some false analogies that have only led to obfuscation by all parties involved. Once we've done that, it will be easier to understand how one might emerge from the turmoil. To be sure, sketching a potential resolution of the crisis in no way assures us that the parties involved will grasp it. But it should provide, I believe, a horizon of hope and opportunity that disrupts the grim logic of the current mayhem. The more immediate cause of the October 7th attack and the war currently underway can be traced to the attempted judicial overhaul, as it was called, by the newly installed Israeli government, which began in January 2023. Led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is under indictment for corruption, this government is heavily influenced by powerful ministers such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who represent the extreme right, Jewish supremacist, and annexationist wing of the settler movement. The goal of the so-called reform was to mortally weaken the Supreme Court, which constitutes the last bastion of democracy and the rule of law in Israel. This was to have served as a crucial phase in the absorption of the West Bank and the potential ethnic cleansing, or at least total repression of the Palestinian population there. Now, the attempted governmental coup, which is what it really was, encountered massive opposition from the more liberal sectors of Israeli society, who felt that their own rights and privileges as Jewish Israeli citizens were threatened. But by and large, the Israeli public refused to acknowledge the link between the so-called reform and the brutal occupation of millions of Palestinians that was staring them in the face. It wasn't only necessarily staring them in the face, because many of them were turning their back on it. Staring them in the face is a nice phrase, but in some ways it's the opposite, I would say. Most Israelis, in fact, bought into the argument made for decades by Netanyahu that the Palestinian issue could be managed rather than resolved, knowing that its resolution could only be accomplished through territorial compromise. The months-long protest movement, which included warnings by fighter pilots and members of elite military units that they would refuse to volunteer to serve, tore the country apart and created the impression of growing vulnerability. As social cohesion disintegrated, the Prime Minister stubbornly ignored the rising security threats. Bending over backwards to please his extremist coalition for fear of losing his government and facing time in prison, Netanyahu allowed them to stage ever more provocative events in the West Bank. These, in turn, necessitated transferring security forces needed to protect civilian settlements bordering the Gaza Strip. None of this, it appears, went unnoticed by the leaders of Hamas in Gaza. Finally, to prove his assertion that the Palestinian issue could be indefinitely swept under the rug, on the eve of the Hamas attack, Netanyahu appeared to be heading toward a comprehensive agreement with Saudi Arabia. Some of you may remember that. Arguably the most important Arab state. This agreement could have culminated in a peace deal and a far-reaching economic initiative brokered by the United States, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. Hamas leaders watching these developments from across the multi-billion security fence installed by Israel, must have thought that this was the last opportunity to disrupt Israeli plans and bring the Palestinian issue back to the fore. The timing of the attack, which had in fact been planned for at least a year and probably longer, was likely determined by these factors. The fact that the Israeli intelligence, the leadership of the IDF, and the Prime Minister himself knew about these plans, and we now know that, but chose to ignore them, is proof that for the second time in its short existence, Israel fell victim to the same euphoria of power or hubris that led it to disaster 50 years earlier, on October 6, 1973. And I remember that well because I was a soldier at the time. And hubris, as we know, is the mother of nemesis. The deeper roots of the current crisis, however, go back to the very birth of the State of Israel in 1948. The year before, the United Nations had proposed partitioning mandatory Palestine, the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. While the Zionist leadership agreed to the plan, the Palestinian leaders rejected it. They did so not least because the partition gave over half of the territory, with large Arab populations that would have been transferred from it, to the projected Jewish state, even though the Jews at the time constituted only a third of the overall population of Palestine and owned only a negligible part of the land. This was followed by intensifying clashes between Palestinians and Jews, and later by the invasion of Arab armies seeking to help local Palestinians destroy the Jewish state. The bitter and costly war, and one has to understand, just on the Jewish side, about 6,000 soldiers died in that war. The Jewish population at the time was 600,000. So this was a very costly war, and my parents fought in that war, and for the rest of my life, I would hear about all the friends who were killed there that they lost. Now, this war ended with an Israeli victory, but it also resulted in the expulsion or flight of 750,000 Palestinians from what became the State of Israel, which by then ruled over a much larger area than had been allotted to it in the partition plan. The remaining 150,000 Palestinians who became Israeli citizens were swiftly put under military rule for the next 2 decades, and much of their property and lands were expropriated by the state during those 20 years. This is how the goal of creating a Jewish majority state, which had eluded Zionism until then, was finally, albeit temporarily, accomplished. In 1967, shortly after military rule over Israel's Palestinian citizens was lifted, so there was a period of a few months in which there was full democracy in the area controlled by Israel. Israel won a lightning victory over its Arab neighbors. As a result, it came to occupy the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where many of the Palestinian refugees of 1948 were living. Initially, these newly conquered territories were seen as bargaining chips for a peace agreement in the region. But as time went by, Israelis got used to their much larger country, and a trickle of settlers, initially along the Jordan Valley, and later also in the heartland of the West Bank, began staking a claim for permanent rule over the land, and thereby also over its Arab population. The War of 1973 which the IDF barely won. It was a very difficult war. I can be a witness to that, showed the limits of Israeli power. It forced Israel to hand back the Sinai as a price for a peace agreement with Egypt, the most powerful and populous Arab country. But this agreement also facilitated holding on to the West Bank under the fiction of giving its Palestinian population eventual autonomy. People forget that that was part of the agreement. Of course, that autonomy was never actually granted. Years of growing Jewish settlement, land expropriation, and policies of repression produced two contradictory processes: resistance and negotiations. As has always happened in the past, Israel considered compromise only under pressure. The outbreak of the first Intifada, or uprising, in 1987 revealed that the fable of Israeli, as it was called, enlightened occupation, and I well remember that this term was actually being used, kibush na'or, was a lie. The sight of Palestinian youths throwing rocks at heavily armed IDF troops demonstrated the vast asymmetry of power. It also showed the rage of a population subjected to ongoing humiliation and expropriation. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s were an attempt to finally address the question of Palestinian statehood. This was the result of the realization by Israeli leaders such as Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres that continuing occupation was too costly, both politically and morally. But settlement and resistance also caused growing extremism on both sides. The settler movement sprouted a new version of messianic, violent, Jewish supremacist zealotry that gradually seeped into more and more sectors of Israeli society, eventually infecting also the political and military elites. These religious nationalists seek to create a halachic or theocratic Jewish state from the river to the sea, and to empty it of its Arab population. Similarly, opposition to the compromises made by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, including the recognition of the State of Israel and the ongoing Jewish settlement project, transformed the Islamic fundamentalist Hamas. Initially, a largely peaceful organization dedicated to caring for the poor and the needy and establishing schools, it evolved into an extremist militant group determined to replace Israel with an Islamic Palestinian state. Following the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin in 1995, and despite some clumsy efforts by Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO leader Yasser Arafat, the peace process came to a violent end with the outbreak of the second Intifada in 2000. The result of the hundreds of Jewish victims of suicide bombings, mostly by Hamas militants, and the killings of thousands of Palestinians by Israeli security forces was a dramatic shift to the right in Israel and growing support for Hamas among Palestinians. The lack of peace prospects produced extremism and violence, just as previously hopes for peace had the effect of diminishing militant influence. This is why extremists on both sides reject any calls for compromise, and why the silence of those who wish to see a better world feeds the radicals. This was also how the Zionist goal of creating a Jewish majority state was lost. For today, 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians live often side by side between the Jordan and the sea. Only the Jews live under a democracy and have full rights, although now even their rights are being increasingly threatened by their own government. This is the proper context of the current crisis, an ongoing occupation and a political stalemate that exploded in everyone's face on October 7th, followed by an extended violent response by Israel, whose political goals remain obscure. But while rational politics is on hold, the rhetoric surrounding the events of the last 6 months now has tended to incite ever more violence. In Israel, political leaders and media outlets repeatedly refer to Hamas as Nazis, thereby evoking collective memories of the Holocaust. This is a continuation of a trend that began in the 1980s, whereby the Holocaust has been increasingly instrumentalized to present the conflict with the Palestinians as an existential war of survival. It is also intended to ward off any criticism of Israeli policies as anti-Semitic. The heinous October 7th attack, in which hundreds of Israeli civilians, including the elderly and the handicapped, children and babies, were murdered, women were raped and mutilated, and over 200 persons, some of them in their 80s, others children and babies, were taken hostage, has played directly into this Israeli mindset. For now, most Israelis seem to view the operation in Gaza as a war of destruction against people associated with Nazi-like evil. The sentiment is even more deeply ingrained thanks to a decades-old colonial perception of Palestinians as inferior and not deserving the same rights as Israeli Jews. It is also the product of an internalized fear that Palestinians threaten the very essence of Israel, a state whose main justification is as a haven for Jews who were abandoned to their fate during the Holocaust. Conversely, almost from the very beginning, pro-Palestinian sources have described the Israeli response as genocidal. Rhetoric employed by Israeli leaders, which indeed often called for flattening and eradication of Gaza and referred to Hamas, or more generally to the population of Gaza, as so-called human animals, was swiftly described as Nazi-like. Indeed, it was said to reflect the very nature of Zionism as a form of violent, expansionist racism, reminiscent of the Nazi empire of racial supremacy. Now, as a rule, at least my rule, analogies with Nazism should be avoided. Nazi evil was so extreme, the number of its victims was so enormous, and the devastation it left behind so unprecedented, that the use of Nazism as a measuring rod for other regimes or ideologies is bound to put Hitler and his gang in the lead. But this is also why there is such a temptation to use Nazism as shorthand for whichever objectionable regime and policies one wishes to deride or expose. The more this term is used without any connection to the historical phenomenon itself, the less meaningful it is, ending up as nothing more than a propaganda slogan. The same goes for the term genocide, which all too often is popularly used to describe any kind of mass killing without the slightest effort to examine whether such crimes correspond to the United Nations definition of genocide in the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And yet, this is the only definition that matters as far as international humanitarian law is concerned. We as scholars can have whatever definition we like, but in international law, this is the only definition that actually matters. Of course, it has to be interpreted. In other words, regimes engaged in various types of crimes and oppression are called Nazi, and wars in which many civilians are killed are called genocidal. This rhetoric is employed largely because it is felt that referring to such regimes as merely criminal, not genocidal, or dictatorial, and depicting conflicts in which war crimes or crimes against humanity are committed as anything but genocidal is insufficient and feeble, or even apologetic. Now, this is obviously an unhelpful way to understand reality, but an efficient means to stir up rage and self-righteous indignation, at times giving apparent license to the same kind of violence against one's real or alleged enemies. That is, if we say that they're committing genocide against us, then we have license to act with limitless violence against them, whoever they are. Nevertheless, are such terms applicable in any way to the current situation in the Middle East? Now, it is true that the Hamas Charter of 1988 borrows whole chunks from the anti-Semitic fabrications such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and that it calls for the destruction of Israel. It is also beyond doubt that the Hamas massacre of October 7th appears to merit investigation as a war crime, a crime against humanity, and if associated with a charter, possibly a genocidal act. But this does not make Hamas into a Nazi organization. Hamas does not follow Nazi ideology and does not want to establish a Nazi state of Aryan supremacy. Moreover, Hamas represents a Palestinian population that has been besieged by Israel for 17 years under conditions of deprivation, despair, and humiliation, and that has lived for many more decades, in fact 57 years, under Israeli occupation. One can object to Hamas ideology and murderous methods, yet support the Palestinian struggle for liberation. Similarly, the many Israeli governments, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, have done all in their power to entrench the occupation, expand the settlement of Palestinian lands, and make life increasingly unbearable for Palestinians. There are strong indications that in its assault on Gaza, the IDF has committed war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. At the moment, the IDF may be described as engaging in ethnic cleansing of parts, if not most, of the Gaza Strip. And just to know that there is a debate now whether to allow Palestinians to return to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which has been cut off from the southern part. So will that remain the case, that they cannot come back or not? To be sure, following the fiasco of October 7th, a colossal intelligence and operation failure that stunned the nation, the attempt of the IDF to redeem itself in Gaza can now be labeled also as a fiasco. The IDF has spent 6 months deploying a modern military equipped with state-of-the-art aircraft, artillery, and armored vehicles, initially with hundreds of thousands of troops, against several tens of thousands of lightly armed guerrillas. Yet the two stated goals of the campaign, destruction of Hamas and release of the hostages, have not been accomplished. While about half of the hostages were freed, this was only thanks to a temporary ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners. Several thousand Hamas militants and a certain number of middle-ranking commanders have been killed. But there are still now maybe 135, 134 hostages in Gaza, of whom up to half, maybe even more, are presumed dead. And Hamas leadership is still keeps a hold on power. And its military fighting ability has not been dismantled. In addition, the IDF has been unable to ensure the safety of Israeli citizens, both around the Gaza Strip and in the north, where Hezbollah has maintained a daily barrage of rockets. Tens of thousands of Israeli citizens have been displaced and are unwilling to return to their homes, many of which have been destroyed, without the assurance that attacks from Gaza and Lebanon will cease. And this has been going on now for half a year. But is the IDF engaged in genocide? Under the Genocide Convention, genocide is defined as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, or religious group as such. My sense is that what has unfolded in Gaza can be broken down into several parts. First, the IDF orchestrated the forced displacement of about 85% of the population, about 1.9 out of 2.3 million people, allegedly to remove civilians from areas of military operations. Second, much of the area from which civilians were displaced was destroyed through aerial bombardment, artillery, tank fire, bulldozers, and demolitions. This includes mosques, schools, universities, hospitals, and other public buildings, as well as residential homes. The IDF has also created a new corridor, a separation area between the Israeli side and Gaza within the territory of Gaza, and has destroyed all the buildings there as a kind of no man's land. And the Gaza Strip is not very wide. Third, military operations have included indiscriminate use of munitions. That's well documented. Not least some 2,000-pound aerial bombs, causing high numbers of civilian deaths. By now, probably over 33,000, of whom 2/3 are civilians, half of them children, with thousands more, at least 7,000, buried under the debris. So we're talking about probably 40,000. There are also indications that civilians were intentionally targeted to incentivize them to flee, and their homes were deliberately destroyed to prevent them from returning. Additional structures were demolished to create that security zone that I mentioned between Gaza and the Israeli settlements on the other side. Fourth, the displaced population has been congested into a small part of the southern Gaza Strip, lacking the necessary infrastructure, supplies of clean water, food, and medical assistance, where the danger of epidemics and malnutrition is growing by the day. There are signs that this is intentional policy, consistent with political rhetoric meant to encourage civilians to leave the Gaza Strip altogether. Another 200,000 civilians in northern Gaza are currently suffering from acute shortage of food, verging on famine. All this serves as evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity by the IDF. Additionally, Israeli political and military leaders have made numerous statements indicating an intention to destroy the civilian population of Gaza or to remove most of it from the Gaza Strip. If this situation is not addressed in the immediate future, the IDF and the State of Israel could be charged with the following. First, with forced displacement. Now, under international law, which lacks a specific definition of ethnic cleansing, forced displacement is a war crime a crime against humanity and potentially a genocidal action. 2, causing a humanitarian disaster, which could come under Article 2C of the Genocide Convention, namely, quote, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 3, in case large numbers of civilians are forced to entirely leave the territory of the Gaza Strip out of desperation or military threat, charges could be brought for carrying out precisely what are described in the Genocide Convention, as I mentioned, as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. In fact, this is, of course, as we know, precisely what the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, is currently deliberating, following a filing by South Africa. And as you know, the ICJ issued provisional measures based on the plausibility of genocide. Now, I think the situation can be reversed, although I'm more and more skeptical, but I still hope so. But only massive United States and international pressure and a well-designed strategic and political framework can bring this about. Without such a move, Israeli actions on the ground could be described as ethnic cleansing. Now, ethnic cleansing was defined by the UN Commission of Experts mandated to investigate violations of international law in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. So that's going back to the 1990s, defined as follows. And I'm quoting this definition. It's not still part of this, the definition of crimes against humanity or war crimes or genocide, but the definition exists in this case. It's defined as follows: a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographical areas. What makes the situation even more urgent is that absent speedy international intervention, the expansion of the conflict is a distinct possibility, and we're seeing more and more signs of that, of course, as we speak. As the engagement of Iran and the Yemenite Houthis clearly indicates, ongoing settler violence and IDF killings on the West Bank, which is under the radar, but about 350 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank since the beginning of this war, mostly by the IDF, some by settlers, and not a few of the IDF soldiers there are recruited from the settlers, so they're settlers in uniform. So that sort of ongoing violence of the West Bank may trigger another uprising there, followed by attempts at ethnic cleansing by settlers and allied military units, which is probably the goal of this violence. This may also lead to intercommunal violence in mixed cities in Israel, as happened already in May 2021. There are many mixed cities in Israel with Palestinians and Jews living side by side. Escalating attacks by Hezbollah may unleash another IDF ground attack, which is likely to bog down, as has predictably already happened in Gaza. In short, the potential for growing regional chaos and an endless cycle of killing and destruction is very high. It should be said that both Jews and Palestinians have used violence from the beginning. So there's nothing new about that. But for many decades now, Israel has had far greater power than the Palestinians and has not used it either wisely or justly. It is up to those who have more power to strive for a resolution, but Israel has agreed to concessions only under duress. This is in no way to condone Hamas, but simply to point out that the return of the Sinai after 1973, the Oslo Accords, and hopefully any future resolution of the crisis in Gaza were and will be only the result of external pressure. What is urgently needed now is an international agreement led by the United States and other major European countries, such as the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, and accepted by Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and such states as Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. The agreement will entail a ceasefire by the IDF, return of the hostages in exchange for Palestinians in Israeli prisons, removal to exile of the Hamas leadership, and return of the Gazan population to their homes, which would be rebuilt with international support. This would be followed by a temporary takeover of the Gaza Strip by an international force made up of soldiers from other Arab countries, and a gradual transition to control by the Palestinian Authority under a revamped political leadership. Now, all of this was actually floated by various elements in the US administration. But all this must be done under the umbrella of a general agreement by the Palestinian Authority and Israel to move to a new political paradigm of seeking a resolution to the conflict through negotiations and the creation of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, the chances of any of this happening under the present Israeli government and Hamas leadership are slim, to say the least. But these leaders may be swept away by the political tides. It must be realized that the attempt to manage the Palestinian issue has failed spectacularly. Israel has not been as insecure and vulnerable as it is now since 1948. Yet the means to reverse the situation are clearly at hand. What is called for is a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between the 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians who live between the river and the sea. The leaders who brought their nations to this point have been deeply discredited. Hence the need for an alternative way of thinking about the future. Such rethinking is also bound to bring a change in the immediate situation on the ground. That is, if you promise people some different future, about the present differently. From a desperate effort to restore the balance of terror between two devastated populations, one could imagine a path toward an entirely different future. From harebrained notions of removing the population of Gaza to sites of exile across the globe, one could imagine developing Gaza into the Dubai of the Middle East, as was in fact envisioned all those years ago during the Oslo negotiations. From thinking how to protect Israeli settlements along the Gaza Strip with more and more walls and fences and electronics, one can think of coexistence with the Palestinians, as had in fact been the case in the past, to both sides' mutual benefit. What would such a scenario, a future scenario, entail? How can this land be shared by two groups with such a long history of conflict and bloodshed? Now, there are many such plans, but one of them, called A Land for All, which I recommend that you Google, just write A Land for All and it'll pop up, appears to me to be the most appealing, and I'm sort of moderately associated with it. Most appealing, original, and feasible. And I'll just say a few words about it. The plan, which is the result of years of reflections by a group of Israelis and Palestinians, which usually in Israeli plans did not include Palestinians, this one does, entails the establishment of two states along the 1967 lines. These two states would be in confederation with each other, each fully independent and sovereign, based on a right of self-determination and a right of return, with a common capital in Jerusalem. But what makes this plan different from the defunct two-state solution is that the Confederation would make a distinction between rights of citizenship and rights of residence. So that Jews and Palestinians could be citizens of one state, but reside in another. Hence, settlers who would choose to remain in a Palestinian state would be allowed to do so, yet would vote for the Israeli Knesset and commit to adhere to the laws of Palestine. So they won't be able to go out and uproot olive trees because they'll end up in jail. And Palestinians living in Nablus or returning from exile would be allowed to reside in Israel, but vote for the Palestinian parliament and commit to obey the laws of Israel. Now, this is already, of course, the case in the European Union, where a French citizen can legally reside in Berlin and vote in French elections, and vice versa. A German can live in Paris and participate in German elections, with a common EU parliament in Brussels, to which all members of the EU vote. Obviously, the numbers of foreign residents on both sides would have to be monitored. We wouldn't have 5 million Frenchmen moving into Germany. That would create a crisis. But the borders would, yeah, I mean, I think. But the borders would be open, allowing freedom of movement between the states. Since the entire land is already inextricably connected as far as its transportation, energy, water, cyberspace, and other infrastructure elements are concerned, the confederative institutions would control those links as well as the entity's external borders. Now, how all this would function in detail is, of course, still a work in progress, and we cannot anticipate it happening anytime soon. But as a horizon of political hope and promise, as a path out of destruction and violence, this plan, or others like it, and there are other plans, can change the trajectory of both politics and people's imagination. It can allow the region to set out on a path of reconciliation and coexistence. It also depends on massive involvement by the United States, first imposing a short-term cessation of hostilities, and second, by compelling Israel and the Palestinians to sit down to negotiations over the mutual future. There is, in fact, I believe, no other way forward if we are not to accept the grim logic of the fanatics and extremists who keep seeking the destruction of the other, even at the price of their own annihilation. At this moment of profound crisis, it is time to plan for a different future for generations to come. Thank you. Say that we have a minute to go through.
Yeah, I want to watch
Yeah, we'll just go through them and see. I just want to look for overlap. Here, this is oh, this is Hebrew. Okay, this is okay. No, forever war. I can start with this one. Yeah. Okay. Okay. One of the questions came in Hebrew, so I will translate it for you and try to respond to it. So the question is it possible in the current situation to think about the limitations of national structures? Is one state solution possible? Additional to that, is it possible to imagine a situation of sharing without recognition of the Nakba, that's the word for the expulsion of the Palestinians, the catastrophe, in the current situation. So, yeah, these are two very important questions, and I say the following. My understanding, and that's just, people have different opinions on this. I think that most Israeli Jews and most Palestinians want, more than anything else, two major things. They want the right of self-determination, and they want the right of return. Now, the Jews have it in Israel, right? They created the Jewish state, and they have the law of return. And so any Jew who wants to come to Israel can easily become an Israeli citizen. The Palestinians, of course, have neither. And they want the right of return to be able to return to a Palestinian state, and they want the right of self-determination to have one state. So my view is that a one state, or a binational state, as some would call it, would not be acceptable to either side, because it would be seen as undermining either the existence of these two rights or of implementing them. It would also create a state in which, if not numerically, certainly economically, the Jews would be far superior. So it would create a state, in a sense, where the Jews would be the upper crust and Palestinians would be the lower crust. Now, it is possible, I think it's, if we look far into the future, if one were to create a confederation, that over time, that would change into something else. If there were two states with open borders and with populations living on, different populations living on both sides, either citizens or residents, over time, that may change. And for instance, I think that there are not a few voices in Israel saying that it would not be a bad idea at some point to give up the law of return. That's not something that has not been voiced in Israel, not necessarily in left-wing circles. On the second question, I absolutely agree. That is, I don't think that there can be reconciliation, a true reconciliation, without some kind of truth and reconciliation. I think it would be necessary. It's obviously very difficult right now, so it would have to come as part of a larger political process. But without Israel as a state recognizing what occurred in 1948 and providing the two basic elements of restitution, which were invented in the restitution agreement between Israel and Germany, that is an apology and compensation, it would be very difficult to move forward. But if you do that as part of a political scenario that assures the security, equality, and dignity of both sides, it becomes much easier to do that. The price you pay is a moral price, is some material price, which would not be horrendous, but it's not a political price. And so I think that it would be necessary to do that. Does that answer? I think it was from you, that question, was it? Or for someone else? Oh, from you, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, and I keep looking at that. Does it answer your question more or less? Thank you. Yes.
Can I also direct you to a question online?
Yes.
Maybe the first one.
First one. There seems to be a gap in my narrative for the years 1948-67, when Egypt occupied Gaza and Jordan occupied the West Bank. Would be important to inform your audience about those occupations over Palestinian territories, which are often neglected. So what happens at the end of the War of 1948, the Jordanian Legion has taken over East Jerusalem and what becomes the West Bank. And Egypt has, it's not exactly occupying, but it has control over the Gaza Strip. Jordan, as a country that has large numbers of Palestinians in it, was not a fan of creating a Palestinian state. and was happy to try and keep Palestinians under its own control. But Jordan also, one has to remember, has given Jordanian citizenship to Palestinians. Egypt, for similar reasons, had what was he called? Some sort of control. It was a controlled area for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. They did not become Egyptian citizens. Now that situation, under different conditions, could have continued. And there were Israeli leaders who thought that it might be best, in fact, to make Jordan into the future Palestinian state, that is to topple the monarchy, the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, and to make that into the Palestinian state. But things turned out differently. We don't know what would have happened had the war of 1967 not happened, but it did. And because it did, and Israel took over those territories, it actually got back large numbers of those Palestinians that it kicked out. So it found itself, and that's to my mind at least, the profound irony. It found itself undermining its own stated goal of creating a Jewish majority state. It took back the refugees, those who fled from it, or those it expelled, but of course it did not give them citizenship because that was seen as impossible. And from that moment on, the rhetoric in Israel, and that was not right-wing rhetoric, that was very much Labour Party rhetoric, was that there was a demographic problem. How do we deal with the demographic issue that Palestinians might at some point become the majority population under our control? There would be more Palestinians than Jews. Some of that was resolved because the number of Orthodox Jews kept growing. And in fact, the highest fertility rate is among Orthodox Jews, not among Palestinians. It dropped among Palestinians, it rose among Orthodox Jews, which is why we now have two equal populations. And so, yes, between 48 and 67, there was in some ways, one issue was resolved, the issue of majority Jewish population in Israel. But Israel never and has still not defined what it sees as its ultimate borders. And so when 67 came, the image of the country being bigger, of actually taking over all of historic Palestine, which is mandatory Palestine, changed people's ideas about what is possible. And the problem remained not the borders, which appeared quite nice, but the people living in them. And that is the problem that has never been resolved to this day. And that has now, I think, come to be seen as essential to be resolved. If that problem cannot be resolved, this ongoing crisis will only grow worse. So, yes. Oh, but I can't read all of this. Can we?
I queued them up for you.
Oh, okay, okay. Let's see. Okay. It's good. Okay. This says it is often said that the U.S. could put an end to this war quickly by ending arms shipments to Israel. Do you think this is true? Would Netanyahu sit down at the peace table if the U.S. stopped arms shipments? It seems overly simplistic given how Jewish supremacist the administration is. Okay, so I mean, I don't think the administration is Jewish supremacist. I think that's a stretch, but I would say two things. First, the U.S. could put an end to this war. That is, if the U.S. stopped shipping arms to Israel, the IDF would have to stop fighting within at the most 3 weeks. In fact, the IDF went to that war knowing that it had reserves only for 3 weeks. Now, why they had so few reserves while buying a lot of very, very expensive F-35s is anybody's guess. Doesn't sound to me like a very good strategy, and they were watching what was happening in Ukraine after all, where Ukrainians were running out of artillery shells, but the IDF was running out of artillery shells and tank shells. And they are being supplied in an enormous sort of air bridge to Israel. Now, why does the US not do it? Well, that's already a matter of US policy that obviously has to do with domestic politics. That is, that the administration has to look to its right and to its left. That's what all administrations do. There are very conservative, very right-wing forces among Jews in America, and there are many Jews in America who are demonstrating for Palestinian freedom. There are those and there are those. I think the administration is making a mistake, and I think it could be more forceful with Israel. In Israel, people say the Palestinians understand only the language of power. That may be true, but it's even more true about Israel. Israel only understands that kind of language. And that's what happened several times. In 1956 or 57, Eisenhower said to Ben-Gurion, you have to get out of the Sinai, otherwise you'll pay. And Israel got out of the Sinai. The same happened under Nixon and Kissinger after the War of 73. And right now, just a few days ago, Israel was saying it's doing all it can to help with humanitarian help in Gaza. And then they killed 7 humanitarian workers. Biden put some pressure, and they said, oh, well, actually, we can open also the Erez opening. We can open shipments from the Ashdod port. And suddenly it turned out they were not doing everything they could. They could do much more, but they did it only under pressure. So I think, yes. As for Netanyahu, no. Netanyahu has to have the war. Netanyahu cannot survive, in his mind. I don't know if it's true, but he believes that he cannot survive if the war ends. Because if the war ends, it'll end by some kind of compromise. The people around him, Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, do not want that. They do not want a compromise. They want to use the war to implement their goals. Their goals are to actually empty Gaza and gradually also take over more and more territory in the West Bank. So if he agrees to any compromise that includes ceasefire, he fears that they would leave the coalition. That means his government would collapse. If his government collapses, there would be an election. If there's an election, all the polls show he's out of the game and he may go to jail. I don't think he will actually, but he thinks he might. And so no, that can't happen as long as he's in power. Once he's out of power, who knows? Oh, yes. So do I believe that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance IRA definition of anti-Semitism leaves room for what? For criticism of Israel? No, it does not. And it's a really bad definition. And I'll just say briefly, the IRA definition has been accepted by many countries, including this one, but here it's not the only definition that is being employed. It's been accepted by Germany, very importantly, and has silenced criticism of Israel. And if you read it, you will see that it combines or it introduces into the definition of anti-Semitism criticism of the state of Israel in various forms. It's a bad definition. I don't know if it was intended to do that, but that has been the result. And the Netanyahu government has been pushing it to various countries. There is an alternative definition, and I was part of trying to formulate that, which is a response to that. And that's the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. And that declaration tries to separate between totally legitimate criticism of Israeli policies, including criticism of Zionism, including being anti-Zionist as not being anti-Semitic. One has to remember there are hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Jews living in Jerusalem, in Bnei Brak, in New York, in other parts of the world who are anti-Zionist. vehemently anti-Zionist, but they're definitely not anti-Semitic. They see themselves as the very essence of what Judaism is. So you can be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. There are ways to define what an anti-Semite is. I would say very simply, if somebody who is recognized as a Jew because of one reason or another is attacked on the assumption that because they're Jews, they support Israeli actions in Gaza without ever asking them what their opinion is, that's an anti-Semitic act, right? But if you express criticism of Israel and people disagree with you, that's not anti-Semitism. So it has to do with attacking people for what they are thought to believe in simply because of who they are. That can be racist, and in the case of Jews, it would be anti-Semitic. Yes.
To perhaps this question, public discourse. Here, right?
Yes. How would you suggest we can make changes to public discourse on the subject? It is difficult in the current climate to have debates and discussions without, as you said, automatically being immediately labeled and often ostracized for being an anti-Semite or anti-Muslim. How can a public conversation be created that allows people to discuss this and thereby communicate their beliefs in a solution to their government? So, or the US government, for example. Yes, I mean, it's hard, but I actually think that that's what we need to do. So first of all, we need to inform ourselves. It has to be said, and I know it sounds as a joke, but it's true that there have been documented cases of people protesting, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and when you ask them which river, which sea you're talking about, they have no idea. So it's a good idea. I'm very much in favor of protest, of political protest. I think it's a very good thing, and especially among young people, especially among students. Students and young people have been far too sort of involved in themselves and not sufficiently involved in politics that will determine their own lives in the future. But if you want to be involved, inform yourself, go to the library. It helps. So the first thing to do is to become more informed and active. The second is to understand that there are different opinions, and that opinions are not necessarily, people have different opinions, should not be your enemy. There are, on the margins, people that you cannot talk with. I remember years ago having a conversation with the Hamas member, and there was no, it was even a bit scary because the man was completely very calm and very nice and very polite and totally a fanatic, and you could tell. So there are, and I've had conversations like that, though not many, I have to admit, with some members of the extreme right in Israel. So there are extremes, but between the extremes, the majority of people, as you were saying, I think, among Palestinians and among Jews are not on the extremes. And we have to find a way to speak with each other. We have to do that, because if we don't do that, we are leaving the field open to those extremists, and they're actually right now determining what is going on. They're not the majority, but they have the power. And they have the power because we are silent. And as for the case here, you know, I mentioned it in the past. Samantha Power wrote this really good book years ago, A Problem from Hell, about the case of genocide in the 20th century. But what incentivized her was that she was reporting at the time from the former Yugoslavia, from all the wars and killings and genocide that was going on there. And she writes there about the fact that at least if you live in a democracy, and this is a democracy, the idea of democracy is not only that you vote. The idea is that you become involved in actions that can sway the opinion of your government. You can actually have an impact on your government. Now, your government would not listen to you if we are sitting in this room and chatting. They're not listening to us at all. But if you show your opinion in demonstrations, in petitions, in votes to your representatives, in letters, in emails, you can actually sway your own government. But in order to do that, you have to form a critical mass of people, and you have to know what you want, and you have to try to push in that direction. I think it's possible. I think we saw even what happened in Israel. As I said, there were many limits to the protest movement in Israel, but it delayed, it didn't kill, but it delayed the government, a very extreme government, from actually implementing the judicial coup that it was trying to do. People can do it. And I believe that we should do it, and we should act differently in our own democracies. We should be much more active and much less passive in our own political conduct. It sounds Pollyannish maybe, but I think that, I'll give you one example. We think about the war of Vietnam and the war in Algeria. The reason that these governments, the French government fighting a very brutal war in Algeria, and the American government fighting a very brutal war in Vietnam, the reason that these wars ended was domestic, was because people came out against them. Now, why did people come out against them? People came out against them because both the French government and the American government realized that if they wanted to keep fighting the war, they had to conscript people. They couldn't fight it with professional armies. Conscription meant that, okay, you as young people, as students, suddenly were faced with the threat of going and getting killed in the Sahara or getting killed in Vietnam. And the parents of these young people also realized that the sons, at that time mostly men, might get killed. That triggered protest. And that protest stopped the wars. So it wasn't because they were so worried about the FLN being destroyed, or the Algerians, whether they'd have, would be liberated or not. There were intellectuals who talked about that. But the mass of the people came out because they thought it was in their own interest. And we should think now, what is in our own interest? I think that what is happening in the Middle East now is threatening the stability of the entire region, and may, as we saw now with Iran, may have terrible consequences for world peace. And this is a time for us to actually protest against it, rather than to be afraid of being labeled one way or another. Inform yourself, know how to respond to this kind of labeling, and don't be afraid. Nothing is going to happen to you. Believe you me, I've been talking about this now for 5 months, and I'm alive and well, and I'm not worried about being called a self-hating Jew or unpatriotic or in the pay of Hamas or whatever various hate mailers call me. Yes. Yes.
You pick your,
Okay. There's a question here that says, what is my metaphor of choice to communicate the legacy of shared trauma? Is it like radioactive exposure, or can it be addressed politically? Look, I mean, I think if I understand the question correctly, it's a very important question, and a number of people have been writing about it. There's a very good collection of essays which came out originally in Hebrew and then in English, but with different essays, edited by Amos Goldberg, who is a professor at the Hebrew University, and Bashir, who is a Palestinian Israeli citizen, who is at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, on the Shoah and the Nakba, on the Holocaust and the Nakba. And it opens with an important essay by the two of them, speaking precisely about that issue of a shared trauma. And I should say that in the last 3 months of 2022, just before everything happened, I spent 3 months in Israel interviewing Jewish Israelis and Palestinians who are Israeli citizens about their connection to the place. I interviewed about 55 people. And one thing that was clear, and members of my generation, that is people born mostly in the 1950s, so right after the state was created. And I was struck by how true that assumption was. These were mostly people who grew up in traumatized families. This is not to say that the Holocaust and the Nakba are the same thing. They're not the same thing, and there's no point in comparing them. What is important is that there's a generation of people who grew up in traumatized families, families that lost family members, lost homes, that were displaced, and families in which often there was silence. Because people did not know how to express that, or did not want to expose their children to the stories of their own traumatized past. And when you listen to people talk about that, the very act of listening to them, just sitting there and listening to them speak for 2-3 hours, creates an empathy between you and the people talking about it. And that happened to me with quite a few Palestinians that I was sitting with, and they were talking about what happened to their families, what happened to their parents, what happened to their homes, what happened to their villages. That kind of recognition of the other side's traumatic past, the other side's displacement, the vast effort that went into rebuilding yourself, rebuilding families, rebuilding hope. The very recognition of that shared past can be a path forward. It has often been exactly the opposite. You know, Israelis say, well, I mean, you talk about the Nakba, but we have the Holocaust. That's a much greater catastrophe. And Palestinians say, yes, but the Holocaust was not done by Palestinians. It was the Germans who did it. But the Nakba, you did that to us. So they keep arguing about that instead of recognizing the fact that you have two very deeply injured populations, that if they began to listen to each other, they would actually be able to imagine some shared future. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much.